The concept of hell throughout many cultures and history exists as a place of suffering and punishment. It is a realm home to those who have broken the laws of their respective beliefs and have transgressed most immorally, to the point that forgiveness is beyond them. Murderers, thieves, rapists, and tyrants. These are the likes that one might encounter should they venture into the depths of any hell in any religion. That being said, certain beliefs see that not everyone is damned for the same things, nor are the characteristics of hell unanimous across all religions. Some cultures view certain crimes and their hellish punishments with the utmost severity and reverence. Others are far more ambivalent. Put simply, the expectation of hell depends on who you ask. To the ancient Greeks, hell wasn't just a dismal place where bad people were poked and prodded all day by demons, but it wasn't that much better either. In the Odyssey, Odysseus sails to the Underworld where he reunites with Achilles, who tells him, "I would rather be a menial on earth, bound to an impoverished master, than be a great king among these dead men who have had their day." In his Works and Days, Hesiod describes Hades as a dank house, where there was no bright sun. In Phaedo, a dialogue by Plato, the Greek hell is described as a place for those who have committed many and terrible deeds of sacrilege, murders foul and violent. What sets the Greek hell apart from other hells is the way the whole structure fits into the greater narrative. This isn't just an ambiguous, otherworldly place that only the dead could understand, but rather a geographically complex land that could even be accessed by the living. There were caves one could access to venture into the underworld. There were lakes and rivers that one could sail on to reach it, and there were specific zones within this forsaken land, such as the prison beyond the hell in Tartarus, where only the worst souls went. Today we'll be exploring these desolate and sequestered lands and determining exactly what one might expect from the Greek underworld, as well as what we might see and who we might meet. Today's episode was made possible by Peregrinus Hieroselymus and his work The Princess of the Wraiths. When first presented with this work, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, other than it being Hieroselymus' memoirs. However, I soon learned that this was the story of a man who, like many of us, had sought to find his place in the world through either the confines of science or the magic of spirituality. It details his experience living in Mexico and his journey and transition to living in the UK and Sweden. But this is no ordinary journey, but rather features several mystical accounts, including Hieroselymus living in the region of former Lake Texcoco, which was said to be haunted by La Llorona, sustaining terrible nightmares as a result of a morbid schoolteacher who told him of serial killers and supernatural horrors, and seeing wraiths and ghouls in his bedroom at night. Whilst Hieroselymus provides lots of historical and cultural references in his work, the true interest, at least for me, stems from his insights of ancient legends that surrounds his home regions in Mexico. He speaks eloquently about the dark magic of African diaspora religions, that is aunt-in-law practiced in the night, about mermaid goddesses in the central Mexican highlands, and the worship of dead ancestors, as is done in the Mexican tradition of the Day of the Dead. These elements are blended throughout the journey of Hieroselymus' life, and one can surely appreciate the wealth of knowledge he supplements his story with. If you're interested in reading his memoirs, you can do so for free over on the Internet Archive. Hieroselymus is not asking for any payment for his work, but merely wishes to tell his story and perhaps pass on some knowledge, which I can totally appreciate. Just use the link in the description or click the link in the comments below. The earliest recorded idea of the Greek afterlife and the underworld in general is given to us by Homer in the Illiad, where the dead souls are seen to continue on as mere fractions of themselves, wandering as ghosts or shadows and lacking any real motivation or strength to do much else. One of the reasons for this lifelessness, if you will, stems from the separation of an individual's psyche, their essence, that which is taken from them upon death before they are delivered to this forsaken realm. In Homer's views, the dead were essentially lumped together here and stripped of their identities. Indeed, they were believed to keep their faces, their bodies, but gone were their character and personality. A mere husk remained, and the souls of the dead were perceived to maintain no real sense of what was happening around them, nor what was going on in the world above. This was different from Plato's later interpretation and the greater Platonic philosophy, where the souls of the dead were judged for their deeds when they were living and were segregated accordingly, going on to experience either good treatment or bad treatment. This nefarious land was known as Hades, named appropriately after its patron god, who presided over this land and stole spirits to inhabit it. According to Homer, the dreaded land could be located at the periphery of the earth, sometimes beyond the edge of Oceanus, the ocean, or sometimes far beneath the earth. For the most part, this was not a fiery inferno as commonly depicted in the biblical account of hell, but rather a place more akin to the Mesopotamian underworld Ker, where there was no sunlight but only darkness. This went hand in hand with the idea of Hades being in one's periphery, never seen in its totality, but rather existing as an unseen place that mortals had no business knowing too much about before they naturally got there. Now, this isn't to say that one could not go to Hades before their time. Several Greek heroes are seen doing just that. It's just more the case that no one would want to visit the place. According to author Robert Garland in his work The Greek Way of Death, those residing in Hades would be experiencing a far less animated and enriching existence to the one experienced on Earth. As we see in Odysseus' venture into Hades, the dead, or the shades, don't seem all that capable of talking at all, and it's only when they're offered the blood of the ram that Odysseus sacrifices do they begin to converse with him. Without this sustenance, they are effectively zombified, moving about with no awareness, no motivation, and no semblance of who they once were. Why Odysseus' own mother has no inkling toward him until after she supped from the blood, by which only then does she realize who he is. In that sense, the dead can be rejuvenated, albeit temporarily, though as Odysseus expresses to us, he worries that such an endeavour put himself at risk of being trapped here himself by either Hades or Persephone, who if they were to discover trespassers, would not be pleased at all. Garland adds that one would lack menos, or strength in Hades, but not just this, but also control over one's own faculties. The souls here are rendered witless, which perhaps explains why Agamemnon describes the dead as heedless and uncaring, because once they have died, they have no ability to listen nor offer empathy. The only exception to this rule appears to be Odysseus' prophet Tiresias, whose wits are described as everlasting, and who also gains the ability to speak of prophecies to come. It's amusing then to see other characters in Greek myths attempt to contact the dead to gain advice and wisdom, only to have the authors conform to this Homeric idea and leave the protagonists wanting. For example, in the Greek tragedy Persians by Aeschylus, Empress Atossa attempts to commune with the ghost of King Darius, who appears to be in total ignorance of the world events transpiring and completely out of the loop. Furthermore, it might be reassuring, or even more daunting to learn, that when they arrive in Hades, they appear very much as they would have done at the point of their death. So if you had died at a young age, you would appear in the afterlife and forever after as youthful. Meanwhile, if you died on the battlefield with a sword gorily jammed into your head, you'd probably appear very much in the same way. Not that you'd mind, of course, because the will and sense to do anything would have already been stripped of you. The notion of Hades was believed to shift over time, both in its characteristics as well as its actual location. As aforementioned, Hades was once believed by Homer in the Illiad to be outside of Oceanus, the ocean which encircled Earth and from which all the stars, the sun and the moon arose from. Hades, as a realm beyond the known world, automatically gave it a sense of foreboding and mystery, for no one in their right mind would venture beyond into such an unknown. The uncharted land was bound to be full of monstrosities and danger. Why else would it have lurked so out of the way? This led writers to consider that Hades was a land that one could visit if they truly wanted to, and that they would need to sail west, where they could find hidden portals in the surrounding valleys and mountains that would transport them there. For example, the cave on Cape Matapan, on the Mani Peninsula of Greece, was believed to have been featured in Hercules' final labour, where he was commanded to capture the hellhound Cerberus, who guards the entrance to Hades. In many depictions, Hercules is said to have dragged Cerberus through this very cave, suggesting that this was in fact Cerberus's post, and therefore was an entrance into the underworld. Cave Matapan also features as the entrance into the underworld in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, where after the death of his beloved, Orpheus ventures into Hades to rescue her by way of this cave. Lakes were also believed to be entranceways to this underworld, specifically the Alcestis Lake, which is now marshland at the municipality of Lerna. Here it was believed that the monstrous Hydra guarded the way to Hades, and was also the same entrance by which Dionysius used to find his mother Semele. Ancient Greek geographer Pausanias wrote of this lake, "There is no limit to the depth of the Alcestis Lake, and I know nobody who by any contrivance has been able to reach the bottom of it since not even Nero, who had ropes made several stades long and fastened them together, tying lead to them and omitting nothing that might help his experiment, was able to discover any limit to its depth. Every swimmer who ventures to cross it is dragged down, sucked into the depths, and swept away." A cave near Lake Avernus in the Campania region of southern Italy was also believed to be an entrance to the netherworld, though adopted much later by the Romans. In Virgil's Aeneid, we see the hero Aeneas guided by the priestess Sibyl to this very cave, where he descends into the netherworld and encounters its many horrors. Virgil writes, "At once are heard voices and wailing sore, the souls of infants weeping, whom on the very threshold of the sweet life they shed not, torn from the breast, the black day swept off and plunged into bitter death. Near them were those on false charge, condemned to die, yet not without lot, not without a judge, are these places given. Minos, presiding, shakes the urn. He it is who calls a conclave of the silent, and learns men's lives and misdeeds. The region thereafter is held by those sad souls who in innocence wrought their own death and, loathing the light, flung away their lives. How gladly now, in the air above, would they bear both want and harsh distress." Yet there was more to it than just entering one of these caves. This might have enabled the mad adventurer to enter the perimeter of Hades, but it would all be for naught if he did not cross the river that formed the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a river that encircled the world 7 times and was known most dreadfully as the river of hatred, abhorrence, and unbreakable oaths, for it was upon this river were the gods seen to swear by in many different tales. In volume 1 of the Library of Apollodorus, it is written, "Zeus caused oaths to be sworn by the water of Styx, which flows from a rock in Hades, bestowing this honour on her because she and her children had fought on his side against the Titans." Now, one couldn't just sail or swim upon these waters themselves, no. In later beliefs, they required an escort in the form of the ferryman known as Charon. Charon first appears in the fragmentary Greek poem Minyas, believed to have been written sometime in the 6th century BC. However, ancient historian Diodorus Siculus believed that Charon had merely been inspired by the ancient Egyptian equivalent Aken, who was also responsible for ferrying souls into the Egyptian duat. In any case, Charon's later addition into Greek mythology saw him maintain a pivotal role, not just in the afterlife, but in funerary rites of the deceased. It was believed that if one was not properly buried, and if one was not buried with a coin placed in the mouth for which to pay Charon, then one would not be allowed to cross over the river, and would thus be stuck on the shores of Styx in a perpetual purgatory. In some versions, Hades or Persephone could grant a soul to return to the living, so that they could alert the living that they needed burying. Whilst other versions, including Virgil's Aeneid, suggest that if the deceased were not properly prepared, they would need to wait 100 years before being transported over. In Alcestis, a play by Greek tragedian Euripides, he writes of Charon, "I see him there at the oars of his little boat in the lake, the ferryman of the dead. Charon, with his hand upon the oar, he calls me now. What keeps you? Hurry, you hold us back. He is urging me on in angry impatience." In Homer's Odyssey, the ghost of Odysseus' mother, Anticlea, is seen to describe other rivers and appalling streams that run through the land of Hades. Acheron is the first river she mentions, a dark and deathless river filled with sorrow and pain. It was believed to be a river that pre-existed the River Styx, and perhaps may have been the body of water that served an even earlier humanity before Styx was introduced. In Homer's Odyssey, Acheron is described by Circe as a branch of the River Styx, whilst in Fragment 770 of Licymnius, we are told, "In then 1,000 streams it gushes with tears and pains. The Acheron carries pains for mortals." According to ancient Greek tragedian Aeschylus, Charon did once upon a time sail on the Acheron River, not the River Styx. He tells us in his work 7 Against Thebes, "But sail upon the wind of lamentation, my friends, and about your head row with your hand's rapid stroke in conveyance of the dead. That stroke which always causes the sacred slack-sailed black-clothed ship Charon to pass over Acheron to the unseen land here. Apollon does not walk, the sunless land that receives all men." With Styx being the river of hatred and Acheron being the river of sorrow, Cocytus, the third river in Hades, is the river of wailing. Ancient Roman philosopher Seneca wrote of Cocytus in his work Hercules Furens. "The foul pool of Cocytus' sluggish stream lies here. Here the vulture, there the dole-bringing owl utters its cry, and the sad omen of the gruesome screech owl sounds. The leaves shudder, black with gloomy foliage, where sluggish sleep clings to the overhanging yew, along with various other daemonies." According to Plato's work Phaedo, he notes that the river Cocytus, whilst connecting to Styx, also empties into the even darker realm of Tartarus, which we'll be talking about a little later on. The next river associated with Styx is Phlegethon, the river of ever-blazing fire, that might seem akin to the likes of the biblical lake of fire as seen in the Book of Revelation. Once more, Plato's work Phaedo details it as the third river, which flows between the greater Oceanus and the aforementioned Acheron. He tells us, "And near the place whence it issues, it falls into a vast region burning with a great fire, and makes a lake larger than our Mediterranean Sea, boiling with water and mud. Thence it flows in a circle, turbid and muddy, and comes into its winding course, among other places, to the edge of the Acherusian lake, but does not mingle with its water. This river," Plato goes on to say, "winds about many times underground before it also falls into Tartarus, though on the other side of Cocytus." He also adds that streams of lava that shoot up from various places on the earth are actually offshoots from this deadly river Phlegethon. The last river is the River of Forgetfulness, and goes by the name Lethe, taking after the goddess of forgetfulness and oblivion. In some accounts, drinking from the river could cause forgetfulness, whereas mixing it with the waters of Oceanus, or rainwater, could result in a concoction capable of inducing sleep. Other accounts suggest that the dead could drink from these waters in order to forget their previous lives, or rid themselves of unwanted or tormenting memories that they might have suffered with in death. In his Metamorphosis, Ovid tells us, "Near the Cimmerians, a cavern lies deep in the hollow of a mountainside, the home and sanctuary of lazy Somnus, where Phoebus's beams can never reach at morn or noon or eve, but cloudy vapours rise in doubtful twilight. There silence dwells, only the lazy stream of Lethe, beneath the rock with whispers low, over pebbly shallows trickling lulls to sleep. Before the cavern's mouth, lush poppies grow and countless herbs, from whose bland essences a drowsy infusion dewy distills and sprinkles sleep across the darkening world." According to Edward Brooke-Hitching's work, The Devil's Atlas, he describes the land of Hades after one has successfully crossed the River Styx as positively frightening, with a wild array of beasts patrolling the area before the main doors. Here one might expect to find creatures akin to Scylla, Briareus, Gorgons, Harpies, the Chimera, unless we forget the multi-headed hellhound guarding the very gateway, Cerberus himself. Beyond this, the Devil's Atlas describes Hades as an endless and joyless labyrinth of dark, cold halls, with no shortage of locked gates, serving to remind those that dwell here that there is no escape. Much of the imagery we have of Hades is imagined from Homer's Odyssey, specifically Book 11, where Odysseus descends into the underworld to consult the prophet Tiresias. Here he encounters many spirits or ghosts, sometimes defined as shades, that saunter around him most troublingly. It isn't until he makes an offering to the lower gods and sacrifices a ram in the underworld do the shades get the ability to speak after drinking the ram's blood. Here Odysseus speaks to a former comrade, his mother, and even attempts to patch things up with his former rival Ajax. Once more, this serves as an example of how mortals were able to access the underworld, in this instance for the sake of consulting the dead in order to derive knowledge and wisdom. Yet Odysseus proves to be on edge in the Dark Realm, and doesn't take his presence there for granted, for he is shown to be quite eager to leave the land, lest Persephone or Hades decide to keep him there. We cannot speak of the realm of Hades without discussing, arguably, the worst sector located within this underworld, an area designated to the worst of sinners and those who have personally affronted the gods. Long before Hades had dominion over the underworld, his father, the Titan Cronus, had sovereignty over everything, and whilst this land on the outskirts of Oceanus most likely had already existed, there was another place even further below this land known as Tartarus. At the point of consolidating his power, after castrating his father Uranus, Cronus gradually grew paranoid of losing his throne to would-be assailants and rebels. The most obvious party to fulfill something like this would have been the ancient Cyclopes and the 100-armed Hecatoncheires, based purely off of their sheer size and strength. No text gives us any indication that these giants were plotting anything of the sort, but Cronus grew so weary of their power that he cast them into Tartarus and placed the monster Campi there as a god. Campi was an amalgamation of animals, most prominently a scorpion, and was known to whip and torture the giants who had been bound here. By the time of Zeus's uprising, Zeus would kill Campi and free the giants from Tartarus, enlisting them to fight against Cronus, who had imprisoned them. After defeating his father and taking his place as ruler, Zeus in turn cast Cronus and many of the other titans into Tartarus in what might be read as a form of poetic justice. The Titans in Tartarus were not believed to have had a good time in this desolate prison, and were known to be tortured severely for their allegiance to Cronus. Tartarus could quite simply be known as the hell within hell, a special sort of place reserved for the worst of the worst. For example, accounts note that the giant Titius was stretched out on the ground as vultures pecked apart his liver for eternity. King Tantalus was forced to stand in water up to his chin, which lowered each time he attempted to drink from it, cursed never to be able to quench his thirst, yet taunted by it all the while. King of Ephyra, Sisyphus, was cursed into an endless loop, where he was forced to roll an enormous boulder up a rocky incline, only to see it roll back down whenever he managed to reach the top. Whilst Tartarus was known as the forsaken and miserable home of the Titans first and foremost, it would later consist of lesser gods and even mortals who would earn the fury and scorn of the more prominent deities. In his work, The Greek Way of Death, by author Robert Garland, he writes that Tartarus was primarily a place of punishment for disobedient gods, and that this was a dark, windless, and seemingly subterranean pit. In the Iliad, it is referred to as far beneath Hades, as Earth is far beneath heaven. In his Theogony, Hesiod describes an anvil falling from heaven as taking 9 days to reach the earth, but that it would take more than 9 days to reach Tartarus if the anvil was dropped from the earth. Yet Garland also concedes that Tartarus does not feature as prominently in the mythology as Hades does, particularly amongst later writers. Aeschylus describes it as a place of both punishment for disobedient gods and the home of Eumenides, or the Furies. Theogenist Pherecydes described it as a place guarded by harpies, possibly warding the Titans and the disobedient gods, whilst the pseudo-Hesiodic Aspis, a poem otherwise known as the Shield of Hercules, it is used merely as a synonym for Hades. In his work, The Greek Way of Death, Garland takes issue with Odysseus' descent into the underworld, remarking that one might be forgiven for thinking that this was anywhere else in the world, for Homer is not very detailed about exactly what Hades looks like and what life is like here. He adds that Hesiod in his Works and Days and Theogony isn't that much better, referring to a land as prominent and feared as Hades as merely an icy land full of echoing corridors. It is surely significant that later Greek literature has left us with no picture of the underworld, which might be considered representative of ordinary Greek belief, Garland states, before going on to remind us that it isn't until comedies like The Frogs by ancient Greek playwright Aristophanes does the Greek underworld ever really get its characteristics. In this text, Hercules describes the moments after crossing the River Styx and disembarking from Charon's boat, where he encounters serpents and beasts in the thousands, a mass of mire, and everlasting dung. So, for those of you planning to hang out on the shores of Styx instead of paying Charon to ferry you across, you might actually be onto something. At the very least, it probably wouldn't have smelled half as bad. As far as Garland is concerned, it seems clear that the Greeks might have revered Hades and believed it could be trespassed upon before one's time, but they weren't all that keen to establish a consistent and detailed mapping of the area. Perhaps this was intentional, a means by which to exemplify just how big and daunting such a place as Hades was, that it couldn't be mapped out, and that the routes and landmarks found within were meant to be vague and shrouded in secrecy. The fact that the region was regarded as dark and icy might give some credence to this idea, for no place like this was meant to be fully understood, at least not by the likes of the living. Fear of the unknown was arguably the greatest fear that one could have of the underworld, and not knowing what to expect was the best way to convey the terrors that might have awaited. A hellhound with multiple heads, a set of daunting rivers, and a collection of monsters from harpies to gorgons may have all come from the same traditions, but since they are all attached to a greater narrative from a number of different authors who all lived in different centuries, there is simply no synthesized view of what Hades would have looked like. With that, it would appear that the Greeks may very well have been as much in the dark about Hades as we are now. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.